Welcome back to the Molpigs podcast. Today your guest is Sifang Chen. Also with me today are Boya.
Hello.
Georgios.
Hi.
And I'm Hannah. Sifang is a science policy postdoc at the Engineering Biology Research Consortium, EBRC. Her work focuses on policies related to synthetic biology and biotechnology, specifically on how to advance the field to help fight climate change and make our future more sustainable. Prior to joining EBRC, she worked on lawmakers biosensors for pollution detection and DNA-based programmable materials at Molecular Information Systems Lab, MISSIL, and Microsoft Research's Urban Innovation Initiative. Sifang received her Ph.D. in physics from the University of Washington in 2019. Sifang, hi.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you here. So, I want to start with following up on your focus on sustainability. So, how exactly can synthetic biology and biotechnology in general help with sustainability and the fight against climate change?
Yeah, sure. So I think when people think about synthetic biology right now, it's we think about how to use the tools of genetic engineering to engineer organisms, right? Like CRISPR. There's a lot of sort of genome engineering when it comes to that, but really, I think synthetic biology has a lot of promises when it comes to solving a lot of the climate and sustainability challenges that we have today. Because if you think about the biosphere, right, consisting of trees and soil microbiome, a lot of that is very much responsible for helping modulate our climate, helping clean up our environment, very key to kind of, keeping our environment clean and making our world more sustainable. But right now, those particular ecosystems are also under threat, both from human activities and also from climate change itself. And so there's a lot of things that synthetic biology could do. So one of the areas that has a lot of promises that I think it's quite apparent to a lot of people is that sector in food and agriculture. So food and agriculture specifically, when it comes to crop production, there is a lot of emissions that's associated with crop production. Some of it coming from fertilizers. So the industrial processes of making fertilizers has a very large emissions footprint with a lot of nitrous oxide emissions. And then also, as you probably all know, that meat production is responsible for a lot of greenhouse gas emissions as well, from cows metabolizing the kind of feedstock that they eat, and then they emit a lot of methane through enteric fermentation, right? And so some of the methods that currently people are working on to reduce emissions in agriculture include, kind of using synthetic biology methods to engineer better fertilizers that will have sort of less of an emissions footprint, that kind of takes the symbiosis of plant and soil microbiome and sort of use a more natural method to fertilize these plants, and that decreases the greenhouse gas emissions from fertilizing your crops. And then also there's work that's ongoing, for instance, in decreasing the amount of methane that's coming out from livestock production, for instance, engineering the gut microbiome of cows or other ruminants, and also, making the feed to livestock less likely for the livestock to emit methane as a result. And so there are a lot of other areas where synthetic biology could help. So another area is in the area of sustainable fuels, sustainable biofuels, where there's a lot of advances in that area. So in particular for sort of heavy transportation. So when we think about transportation, a lot of vehicles today are being electrified, right? And they're running on these lithium-ion batteries, but then they have a certain energy density that's associated with them. And engineering biology or synthetic biology could sort of make biofuels that have higher energy densities that could sort of be used in transportations that need fuels that have a higher energy density than batteries, for instance. And so there's a lot of opportunities in that direction as well. So I'm only picking a couple sectors here where synthetic biology could have a pretty big impact when it comes to reducing emissions and then helping sort of advance sustainability initiatives. Um, so I think there's a lot of enormous opportunities in those areas, but at the same time, there needs a lot more research in many of these areas as well.
Cool. So when you say research, how far along are we on these different fronts? Like, is there a kind of timeline when we might start to see these make a big impact?
I think, given the urgency of the climate crisis, it's very important for a lot of these research to move faster than, they would have originally moved. For instance, when it comes to these type of fertilizers that I was talking about before, right? A couple years ago, they might have been just kind of used as sort of more niche products where certain growers who are more sustainability or climate conscious will be using these kind of products. But now we realize that because of how urgent the situation is, that you need to have more investment into the research so that the production of these types of new fertilizers can actually be scaled up further to sort of an industrial scale to actually transform what the kind of agriculture that we have today and to drastically eliminate the emissions from those sectors. And so, if the timeline before was unspecified or maybe 30 to 40 years now, with all these climate targets, right, that we're shooting at 2030, 2050, that timeline really needs to be sped up.
And because all of these approaches come from synthetic biology, and there are these concerns from the public around that kind of thing, is this where you're focusing from a policy perspective? Like, are you trying to make it more possible for synthetic biology applications to get approval? Or is it more about speeding up the research and increasing the investment?
Yeah, that's a really good point that you brought up about the sort of public perceptions and concerns about synthetic biology. So I would say that my research is kind of encompasses both of those aspects. One is, thinking about how we can engage the public better, how we can improve kind of the public perception when it comes to synthetic biology, genetically engineered products. And then on the other hand, also think about what kind of research do we need to actually push the field further forward so that we can have these sort of demonstration projects, right? Things that are at the demonstration level or things that are at the industrial scale. And there's a lot of exciting research coming out of synthetic biology, and then there's also a lot of startups that are, now working on very exciting synthetic biology related products, but then there's still that sort of chasm of translation between academia and industry, right? And so how do we sort of urge funding agencies to provide more support for that kind of translational research? And where should that money go to? What kind of research? Where sort of are the bioindustrial needs that investment should be directed? So it's kind of encompassing both aspects of what you just said, I think.
So you mentioned academia and industry. So I want to talk a bit more about your journey from kind of there to where you are now doing policy. So you started doing a kind of research with quantum and graphene-based devices. Well, firstly, how did you come across molecular programming, and what made you switch from what were already really exciting topics into this exciting topic?
Yeah, so so I can start with how I got into the work I was doing on graphene and sort of quantum computing, and then how I migrated into molecular computing because they were like all kind of connected. So I mean, when I was in high school, like I read a lot of sci-fi, and in particular, Isaac Asimov's sci-fi, and then one of the I think short stories that he had. It's called The Last Question, and it's about these engineers who like just over over the entire span of human civilization, going from when humans invented the vacuum tube computers, and then to like the next generation of computers, and then I think the one coming after that was a biological computer, and then this whole time they were trying to figure out this question of how to reverse entropy. And then eventually, should I give spoiler alerts? Sorry, spoiler alerts for anybody who hasn't read this story. You should go read it. Is that humans finally solve this last question, and then they reverse entropy, and then there's like a whole new universe, and it's just a great story. And so that was actually quite formative to why I wanted to start doing some work on computing, because it seems like to me it was human civilization also progressed sort of along with our ability to do different kinds of computation. And so I was a physics major when I was in undergrad, and then I was really interested in this whole idea of quantum computing, because that was sort of being proposed as like the next generation of computers, right? That's going to advance our ability for computing things by orders of magnitude. So that was really cool to me. So I started working on graphene, which at the time was just I think was only discovered a couple years before I started this research, and it was really exciting. And then continued doing that into grad school, and so that's where I was in my first year of grad school. And so what happened with that lab was I personally didn't mesh super well with the lab, and uh, and so for anybody who's listening, if you're in grad school and you don't particularly like the lab you're in, it's totally fine if you want to switch to a different lab. And so I was still really interested in these types of unconventional alternative computing. And then I read, I think, a Scientific American article about biological computing. I was like, oh wow, this is really interesting, because I've never taken a biology class ever, except maybe grade 11 when I was in high school. And so I was like, well, you can actually do computing with biology, but then also at the time, it's like, well, it's very natural, right? Because human brains are one of the most powerful computers that we know in existence. And so it was really interesting that you could sort of engineer biology to do computation. And then I looked up sort of UW labs who are working on biological computing, and then I found Georg Selig's lab, who's my PI throughout my grad school. I joined his lab, and then he was working on DNA circuits at the time, and so I started a project working on DNA-based circuits and computing, and so that was really cool, and so that's how I kind of got into molecular computing. And so my graduate project, my PhD project, was on programmable materials based on DNA. So there's this concept of active matter and programmable material that was just really fascinating to me. Being able to sort of trigger things and for them to transform in and sort of do these kind of spatial computing using biological components, that was a concept that was really appealing to me. And so that's why I chose my PhD project to be this. And when I was presenting this was during my general exam. One of my colleagues from another lab came up to me and was like, oh, we actually have this project at Microsoft Research that we're working on these programmable materials that can sort of respond to the environment. Would you be interested in joining us for an internship this summer? And so I was like, whoa, that's really cool. So, like at that time, I was already sort of reading up more about climate change and a lot of these sustainability issues. I was really interested in sort of doing some research in that area. I was kind of on the side volunteering with some environmental groups, but then there was not really a good way for me to combine those two interests of mine together. And so this was the perfect project for me. So I was like, yes, I am on board. So I joined that group, which later became the Microsoft Research Urban Innovation Group. And so that first project that I had as an intern there was working on this colorimetric sensor that is able to detect UV light, and it will change color based on the amount of UV that you're exposed to. And then we kind of made it as a kind of a artistic tattoo that you could just put on your skin, and we kind of calibrate it so that people with different skin tones can use it. So a lot of UV sensors, it's not super sensitive to people who have darker skin tones, and so that was one of the like a really big part of this, so that it's more accessible to like everyone. And so that project was just really interesting because there's that social aspect, the human computer interaction aspect, because we also developed kind of a computer or a mobile app that will kind of look at the color of the UV patch, so it can tell you the cumulative UV index that you have been exposed to. And so there was all these different aspects of the social aspect, the environmental aspect, and then sort of that computer science aspect. So that was really interesting. And then the next project that I was affiliated with on that same team at Microsoft was working on environmental sensor for water pollutant detection. And so this was the idea was developing some sort of biosensors to detect pollutants in water. And so the idea is that we want to develop these really cost-effective sensors that can be easily deployed to sense different types of contaminants in water. And the issue that we want to solve there is for a lot of cities, especially cities who are sort of coastal frontline communities, for instance, cities in Florida, right, who are dealing with issues with stormwater runoff or sea level rise. There's a lot of flooding into the city, and with that comes a lot of different types of pollutants that come off of pavements on the roads, and you want to be able to detect that. And so cities don't have a whole lot of budget to do that kind of monitoring. And so when they do, it's very infrequent. And then when they do perform that sampling, so they literally send somebody out and they will go to a lake or like a shore, and then they'll pretty much take the same sample from the same place once, like every 2 weeks, for instance, and then that sample gets sent back to the lab. And so that whole process is actually surprisingly expensive, because then that sample gets sent to a different lab, and then when you're trying to detect contaminants in water, you really want to be able to do this in real time, because there's also certain chemical reactions that would occur as you're transporting the water sample from point A to point B to point C. And then as time progresses, your measurements are just not as accurate. So we wanted to be able to deploy, sensors where we can measure it in real time, and it can be done cheaply. So that was kind of the goal of this project. And so I was very involved in that particular project, trying to develop biosensors based on different types of biomolecules that can sense different types of chemical contaminants in the environment, and then developing kind of a prototype for that. And so there, that was kind of also my foray into a little bit, not really science policy, but being able to more interface with people who are in the community. So in my capacity as a scientist and engineer, a lot of times I'm developing things that's just in the lab, right? I'm like focusing, here is a problem that I'm presented with, trying to come up with a engineering solution to this, but then without really thinking about the kind of human factor that's in this. So a lot of it is, to me, was kind of abstract. And then, but for this project, because it's going to be, we're partnering with municipalities. So we're going out to talk to people who are kind of on the ground and know these kind of problems on the ground. So for instance, one of the groups that we talked to was a citizen science project, who are they I think they patrol the base in Tacoma, and then they kind of monitor the ecology there. And so talking to them about what kind of problems they encounter and what kind of needs that they really, what are the needs that they want to fulfill when it comes to developing a sensor, understanding that need, and then trying to incorporate that feedback into our design. That was a really eye-opening kind of experience. And there was kind of this whole new world that was kind of opened up to me. I was like, oh, there's this kind of social aspect to science and to sort of technology development. And so I was really interested to wanted to explore that aspect more. And so that's kind of how, through this kind of convoluted trajectory, how I arrived at doing science policy here at EBRC. So like I still want to be able to help advance the science, but also at the same time, I think climate change is, and the climate emergency now is really, it feels very urgent. And I want to be able to kind of leverage my scientific background to help with that in some way.
And how does your work currently, like in science policy, how do you actually get to a position where you can put pressure on the lawmakers to actually kind of listen to you and implement correct science policies?
That's a great question. So a lot of the work we do is we do a lot of communication. And so that's not necessarily public communication, which we also do, but a lot of it is communicating between the policymakers and the researchers. So for instance, the policymakers who are busy doing their policymaking are not necessarily aware of the scientific advances that are happening, for instance, in synthetic biology, right? So as for instance, Congress is deciding where budget is supposed to go, and that money goes to, for instance, the NSF, right? And then you have NSM program managers who are supposed to disperse that money into certain types of projects that they will be interested in. What should those projects be? And so we're part of my job and EBRC's job is to help these funding agencies identify what those research priorities should be. And that comes from the research community. Synthetic biologists saying, these are the research advances that we think should be made in the next 5, 10, 20 years, but then there are all these gaps that need to be filled, and this is where investment should be directed to. So we're communicating that need to the policymakers. And also at the same time, there's information flow from the other direction. So the other part of our job is to communicate what's happening on the policy side to researchers. So you're all researchers. You're probably not going to have a whole ton of time to look at what policy developments are coming out from, for instance, the White House, right? Or if you are, you don't have time to read those in detail. And so we try to parse that information and then provide that information in a timely way to researchers so they can sort of have an idea of what is happening at the federal level when it comes to science policy.
So you said one of the things you said was about kind of advising on what kind of projects should be funded. So like in rocketry, for example, and interstellar travel, you've got this thing called like the weight dilemma, which is do you launch a rocket now to try and get to where you're trying to get, or do you wait a while for technology to progress, in which case you'll build a better rocket and you'd have been able to overtake the one that you would have launched 50 years ago. Is there a kind of similar thing with the kind of research that we should be doing for mitigating climate change using synbio? Because we could implement things right now if we wanted to, or we could invest that money into tech research, which might in 20 years' time yield something 100 times more effective.
That is a really interesting proposition. And I have not thought about that before. But I would say, the difference between that analogy, the paradox that you have just mentioned, and climate change is that the former doesn't really have a timeline, right? It doesn't really have that urgency. If we don't do this in 20 years, we're still going to be fine. When it comes to climate change, that's not the case, right? The later that we take actions about about reducing emissions, about mitigating emissions, and now because climate actions have been delayed for so long that we have to remove these emissions that's already existing in the atmosphere, right? The more we kind of have to catch up because the climate is not going to stay static, right? So the more greenhouse gases there are in the atmosphere, the more warming there's going to be, and then with that there's that feedback loop, and things are going to get worse. Right, there's further climate events that will happen, and in addition to mitigation, which is reducing the amount of greenhouse gas that we emit and the greenhouse gas that's in the atmosphere, there's also climate adaptation, which is responding to all those negative impacts that will come from climate change. And so the adaptation part I think increasingly is going to be a bigger and bigger portion of our climate response. And so I think compared to, the rocketry thought experiment, where there isn't really a timeline there, unless I guess if there's an alien invasion and really need to get off Earth. Then here with the climate issue, it really is an emergency, and I think we need to sort of identify where the highest leverage areas are, where which technologies can make the most impact, and not just in sort of the short term mitigating climate change, which is very necessary. So I'm talking about things like carbon removal, right? So some of the technologies there could potentially if you can draw down carbon very quickly, but then what are sort of the long-term sustainability consequences there? So you kind of have to think about that as well. But yeah, so my general point is that we need to invest money into those kind of research ASAP, and so there's not really so we can't really wait to implement those kind of technologies.
Molpigs is sponsored by Teddybit Nanosystems. Teddybit designs and produces DNA nanostructures, as well as standard and customized scaffold DNA strands. They would be happy to set up a call to discuss your project in more detail. If you are interested, please visit their website at teddybit.com or contact them at info@teddybit.com. That's Teddybit spelled TILIBIT.
So I'm wondering, what are the new skills required for you to be for you to transit from a scientist to be a more like policymaker postdoc? And I also wonder, how does your day look like for your job, like instead of doing science?
Sure. Yeah, I'll answer the first question first. What are the new skills that I needed to kind of acquire to get into this job? I mean, when I applied for this postdoc fellowship at EBRC, I really didn't have any experience in science policy aside from the sort of experience in environmental environmental monitoring and sensing research that I talked about before, and then my time spent with doing some of the volunteer work I did with climate and environmental groups, and I think a lot of it, so I've seen this with a lot of people who are in science policy, is that they get into it through this really circuitous route, and many of them are from a totally scientific background. They come from the lab often directly, and maybe they have some science policy experience under their belt because they have that interest, or they had the interest when they were in grad school. But a lot of it is people coming into this field completely anew, and then you learn a lot of things on the job. I think a lot of it is just the interest in doing this kind of work and the enthusiasm for it, and you kind of learn the rest of it just on the job. And so that kind of goes into your second question of what I do on a daily basis. And so a lot of it is, I would say, writing. There's a lot of writing, reading up on all sorts of different materials, including policy, new research advances in science and technology in the areas that we're interested in. There's a lot of meetings with sort of coordinating meetings as well with different types of stakeholders, researchers, people who are in government, who are in industry. And that part of the job is actually really interesting because you really get to talk to people who are coming from pretty different backgrounds, and they have different point of views and different perspectives. And it's really interesting to me to make that connection. People from different disciplines with different life experiences, and then trying to make the connection between all those different areas of expertise is actually really cool.
Do you find that those people coming from different perspectives, are they receptive to what you're saying? Is there some kind of, do you need to kind of push policymakers and those stakeholders to take climate change seriously, or is there a big concerted push now, do you find?
Yeah, I would say so. For me, in my job specifically, there is a lot when I do interface with people, it's also a lot of times with researchers as well, trying to just meet with different researchers who are already in synthetic biology, and there isn't really a lot of convincing that needs to happen, because I would say, I mean, it's makes me very optimistic that there's a lot of interest within the synthetic biology community to work on solutions toward climate change, and so yeah, really, sometimes when it comes to emphasizing the importance of coming up with different climate actions and approaches, it's like singing to a choir, like because they already know the importance of the climate emergency, and they want to work on it. And I think it's just identifying like where are the most impactful areas to hit. That's yeah, I would say there's has not luckily not been a whole lot of frustrations when it comes to that.
What's the kind of highest up policymaker you've talked to, like senator level above?
So I haven't talked to a lot of politicians in my current work, just because I'm a postdoc. My boss will be the one who will talk to these politicians. We do sometimes have requests for information or RFIs from different levels of government. And this could be from the federal level with responses to requests for information to the executive branch, from the state level, responding to requests for information from the state legislature, or sometimes we have some requests at the international level as well. So this would be like intergovernmental agencies, for instance, where essentially the policymaker would ask us for information on what synthetic biology could do for X, Y, and Z social issues, and what are sort of the upsides and the downsides to this. And the reason they would ask us is because we more or less are seen as a neutral party who are representative of the synthetic biology research community. And so our opinion is sort of respected as a more sort of objective third party, providing this kind of information that's coming from the research community itself.
Do you feel, I don't know how to put this, but do you feel listened to by the policymakers?
I would say that from where I stand, it's kind of hard to do, attribution in terms of the work that you do in the policy world, because sometimes the best you could hope for is that you see, a sentence that you've written as part of a policy recommendation is being quoted in a policy announcement that comes out, from the government or some other organization. And you really hope that you get the audience right, and then the people who you're targeting are actually going to think about your policy, and then hopefully they think that it's a good idea and are persuaded, and they will try to incorporate them into their own policy framework. So attribution, like I said, is kind of hard, unlike in academia, where you kind of can get your paper or get your name being cited as part of somebody else's work. Here, it's more like, you see your policy recommendation. If somebody thinks that it's a good idea, it's being incorporated as part of another policy announcement. So again, like I'm still relatively new at this, a little bit less than a year as a postdoc in science policy, and my experience is kind of limited here. So I would imagine if you come back in a couple more years, I will have a different perspective and a different answer to this.
Are there enough people, like, say, scientists transitioning into policymaking? And if there aren't, why might that be? And, like, what can we do to change that?
Yeah, anecdotally, I mean, of course, this is from, my point of view. And right now I'm working with a lot of science policy people. And so my view is naturally going to be biased. And I'm like, oh, there's a lot of science policy people out there. But I think there is a lot more people who are interested in science policy because, I think grad students nowadays and young researchers are really engaged with social issues. And there are a lot of social issues out there that need to be solved or have, to be addressed or have attention paid to. And a lot of them can benefit from people with a scientific background. Because when you think of the scientific method, for instance, right, you're really coming up with a hypothesis, and then you're trying to collect evidence, and then you're trying to come up with a conclusion. And I think really good policymaking, in some respect, should follow the scientific method in some way. When you're coming up with a policy proposal, you're really coming up with a hypothesis. You're saying, X, Y, and Z is insufficient, and then instead we should do this. That's your hypothesis. And you try to gather a bunch of evidence, right? So it's evidence-based policymaking, right? COVID is a perfect example of that. That when we have these, massive globe-spanning issues, that science should be at the forefront of informing policymakers. And so I think it could actually really benefit the policy world, could benefit a lot from people with a scientific background. And I think scientists, early researchers, are realizing that. They realize that there is a need for their expertise. And so I think there is a lot more interest in this. But I would say when it comes to sort of engaging young researchers coming into the policy world, the barrier to entry is still kind of high, because I think a lot of times when you're in grad school, I think now there's sort of that industry track, right? That people are becoming sort of more aware that there's things outside of academia, but then it's still sort of, for instance, when I was in grad school, I didn't realize that science policy could be a potential career path at all. But only when I started reading about it, I was like, oh, this is perfect. Like, this is exactly what I wanted to do. So making those opportunities, either internships, there's the AAAS fellowship, where it gives scientists the opportunity to work in one of the federal agencies for a year, or sometimes Congress for a year. It is a great opportunity. But it's not necessarily available to all grad students. If you're an international grad student, then you're kind of out of luck. And so making those opportunities more available, and then just some way of having grad students more aware that this is a potential career path is going to be really helpful, I think, in engaging with people. And you might have, a lot of people potentially who would be interested in this, and but who just don't know that this is a potential path to take.
Do you at some point miss traditional science?
Yeah, I mean, I think I do sometimes. I don't miss lab work, I would say. I think, I think I've had enough days pipetting, but I do love reading up on new advances in science. I mean, it's also part of my job, but but I think I really really enjoy the work I'm doing now. So I don't miss traditional science, I guess, quote unquote, as much. Yeah.
So obviously, policy work and traditional science are quite different day to day. But if you had to pick one main difference from before you went into policy, when you were doing more traditional science, and what you're doing now, what would that main difference be?
I think the biggest difference is depth versus breadth. So for when you're working on a research project, or even a couple of different research projects, you're really doing a deep dive into that research, and you're really sort of obsessing about the details about that particular research project, and really thinking about sort of all the little granularity of that project. Whereas when it comes to science policy, is a lot more of a generalist approach, because you sort of have to read up on a lot of different subfields. For instance, when it comes to synthetic biology, knowing, for instance, what are the new advances in food and agriculture? What are some of the advances in, say, bioplastics, right? And then, so this is, I'm thinking of what I'm doing with climate and sustainability, and then making the connections between those two. And then, a bunch of other subfields of synthetic biology. And so it's a lot more breadth versus doing that deep dive. And you kind of have to be on that sort of high level, big picture, kind of zoomed out view to make those connections. So it's kind of a different, you have to put on different lenses, I think, for the different types of work. Yeah. I would say that's the biggest difference.
Do you think it helped that you've kind of gone through all of these different fields? You've started in physics, you've done some CS, you've done some bio, you got exposed to the sociological aspects, you did all of these different things. Has that been a massive help to you in doing this broad brush approach?
Yeah, I think so. I think that it's kind of intertwined, right? My experience with being in a bunch of different fields, I think also kind of informed why I am where I am now, is that I really wanted to, be able to kind of keep up with research in all of these fields, and then not really focus in one particular one. And I think the fact that I was kind of in physics and then I was in biology and sort of nanotechnology, it helps a lot with my current job because of that, what I was talking about, that generalist approach to it, it helps me understand a lot of these different fields a little bit better than I think if I was focusing on one particular one. But yeah, I think it's a combination of just my interest and my experience as a researcher.
So what would your ideal future after all of these policy initiatives that you're coming up with get applied, treating the world with synthetic biology? What would that ideal future look like in, say, 20 and 50 years?
So first, I hope that synthetic biology, along with other technology developments and policy initiatives, could enable us to transition to a post-fossil fuels world and can really help us meaningfully address the climate crisis. For instance, with synthetic biology and biotechnology, enabling the transformation of agriculture and enabling sustainable materials production, helping improve food security and mitigating pollution. And I think second, there's this idea of the bioeconomy, which is essentially developing an economy around products that are made from biology or biotechnology, and then integrating that into our current paradigm of the economy. And how people talk about the 21st century being the century of biology, right? Now that we have the tools to manipulate and modify the genetic code, there's a lot of exciting advancements that's coming out all the time, right? And to me, the most exciting part of this is the link between bioeconomy and the circular economy, and so how biotechnology could potentially enable the world to grow more sustainably. For instance, can develop engineered organisms to recycle or upcycle waste products more efficiently, or to grow food with a much smaller environmental footprint. So enabling us to really be able to use natural resources in a more sustainable way. And I think finally, I would hope that, this 20 to 30 years from now, with all the advancements in technology and all these policy initiatives, we can really enable the world to be also more sustainable and equitable. And this, I don't have a good answer for this, and I think it just needs the collaboration of a lot of different groups of people and some sort of cultural mind shift of the mindset so that we're less exploitative, both of people and natural resources. And I hope the kind of bioeconomy that we're developing now, and I hope to see it flourish in the future, could really enable future growth to be more sustainable and equitable, and lowering the gap of income gap, and also be able to enable us to use natural resources in a more sustainable way, so that our environment are sort of kept in a better condition for future generations.
So you mentioned kind of sustainable growth. I wonder, how do we solve the hard problems of, say, developing countries who they want to use their natural resources like they've seen the developed countries do, and they want to deforestation, increase urbanization, this sort of thing, in order to develop their country, but now we're kind of trying to tell them not to. What's the solution to that problem, if there is one?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think different countries, of course, are at different levels of development. And for instance, more developed countries have different priorities, right? And if you are a country that is currently a low or middle income country, your priorities, part of it is going to be trying to lower the rate of poverty, trying to develop economically. And that would require, to some extent, potentially more exploitation of natural resources. But also at the same time, I think there is this view that developing countries are sort of making these progresses in at the expense of natural resources, which is in some cases actually not true. Because if you look at the sort of environmental initiatives in Africa, it's actually quite progressive there. So I think, was it Nigeria? Or one of the African countries has one of the most strict limits on plastic bags, because people realize that climate change is actually affecting the global south a lot more so than the global north. And as they're developing, they need to incorporate all these sort of more sustainable ways to develop their economy. And it is much better for the long term if you're starting by having these sort of more sustainable, environmentally friendly economic practices versus ones that are more exploitative. And so I think the view that countries who are in that phase of developing their economy and expanding their economy rapidly are doing so at the expense of the environment is there's a little bit more nuance to that as well. And of course, I think because developed countries have the ability to kind of put more money into advancing some of the technologies, for instance, in synthetic biology even, right? That it should take up, more of that responsibility. And historically, right, if you look at the United States, the amount of carbon the U.S. has emitted, or carbon dioxide the U.S. has emitted, is cumulatively the most out of every country in the world. And so we need to do more. And yeah, so that's kind of my take on that.
Are you sure there isn't some selfish part of you that's only doing this policy making in order to keep the environment intact, just so you can keep taking photographs when you go hiking?
It's interesting that you asked this, because the reason I'm doing this kind of goes back to what I was talking about like way earlier about Asimov's Last Question, that short story. And so my initial interest was really, it was in sort of developing new computers, right, unconventional computing. But then the other part of it, I'm actually really interested in space exploration. I think it's just, it would be awesome if humans are sort of in other parts, were enable interstellar travel and able to explore other parts of the universe. And then the idea that human civilizations could keep propagating is something that's really appealing to me. And so I was really interested in also that space exploration aspect of it. And then part of the reason I wanted to work on DNA nanotechnology was, and synthetic biology, was this sort of connection with potentially terraforming Mars in the future or something like that. But then the more I read about, the climate crisis, the more I was like, well, this is the existential challenge to our civilization propagating into the future. And so that is an insurmountable challenge that we have to overcome if we want to continue expanding our civilization in a positive direction. And So really, that's I guess the answer to your question, like why I'm really interested in all these approaches to help fight climate change. It's because of that. How do we develop our civilization in a positive and really sustainable way? Sustainable in the sense that we can sustain the progress and growth of our civilization into the future, and for generations to come.
So after we do terraform Earth, where do you fall on the debate between terraforming Mars or Venus next?
Oh, I think Mars is a much better target. Venus, there's Venus is climate change gone to the extreme, right? It's just greenhouse gas out the wazoo, and I think it's a lot harder to. Well, I mean, I know very little about engineering in space, but I would just say I think from what I've read, Mars at least is a rocky planet. There is underground water that NASA has discovered. I think they even discovered some surface water that's on Mars during the summer seasons, and so that seems to be a lot more viable of a target. And so, yeah, that's where I will take my bias. Is Mars all the way.
Yeah, I wish I could remember. I know that I've heard some people make convincing arguments of why Venus might actually be the easier approach, even though it looks so much worse from the horrible greenhouse gas problems that have happened. But yeah, Mars definitely seems like a nicer place to go to.
But of course, there's very little atmosphere on the surface, and Mars doesn't have a magnetosphere either, so there's a lot of radiation on the surface as well. So there's all sorts of problems there. But if humans do manage to resolve climate change to avoid the kind of coming crisis, then I think space exploration is always just, I think, has a lot of allure to people, and it will inspire a lot of folks.
And I think we can easily terraform Mars because we're very good at making climate change happen.
Right.
We're very good at putting greenhouse gases out.
Exactly.
So I think it's no challenge.
Will you move on to policymaking of how to increase global warming then after decreasing?
Yeah, it's all situational.
Thank you so much for joining us, Sifang. Stay tuned to our newsletter for details on our next podcast episodes, and thanks for listening.